Is it what? Thankfully, I won't be doing it next week, so you guys can tell your friends it's okay to come back. So, who have I taught actually? That was like in the class upstairs. So Lydia, Tori was up there at one point. Lawrence.
Taught us about the different dimensions.
Yeah, no, I mean but in my Wednesday night class. It just feels weird. Michael Stevens, of course. I'm Michael Stevens. Okay, so for this lesson here, it's a Bible study. It's not like a sermon or anything like that. So we're just going to look at something I find interesting in the Bible, make a few observations, and then call it a day because it was a rainy, sad Monday. So first passage we're going to be in is Exodus 3:14. And I'm not nearly as good with like the Apple stuff and projecting onto the screen, so I'm not going to do it. Terrible at it. You'd think I'd be better, but I'm not. So first, I kind of want to. Does anyone really know what like God looks like at all? Like, do you have any kind of concept of that at least? Because we yeah. I mean, raise your hand if you want. What do you think? And brown eyes. So, like, you're trying to describe Jesus then, probably. Okay, yeah, I mean.
Wait, are you asking God?
I was asking God, like God the Father, yeah.
Like us? Because he created us with his own image?
That's a good idea, I mean, right? Because we're created in his image. It's not super far-fetched, right? Yeah. He is pretty bright, exactly. We get a couple descriptions of God in the Bible, right? We don't get anything like super permanent, because, I mean, we were talking about it last night where Pastor Payne was saying, hey, like no man can really even see God. Like we can't perceive him. I think of that story in the Old Testament, right, where they tell, I think it was either Abraham or Moses, and he said to look away, and he only saw his brightness like out of his, like, what is that, peripheral vision? Yeah, he only saw his brightness out of peripheral vision. And so kind of having an idea of who God is, is kind of abstract almost. So we're in Exodus 3:14, and I wanted to kind of tell you that, his physical appearance, we don't really have a great, I mean, it'd be hard to put it into words, right? But we can know where he is, right? I mean, physically, he's where? He's in the third heaven, right? Like, if we were to draw kind of, I mean, there's a circle down here, right? But we have, that's hell, right? And then what surrounds hell? You have Abraham's bosom, or paradise, right? And outside of that, we have the earth. And then the earth's atmosphere is the first heaven, right? And then the outer space, right? The things that we can perceive out there, the vacuum, right? That's the second heaven. It contains the stars. And then beyond that, the border between the second and the third heaven is a wall of ice. And beyond that is the third heaven, where God is said to be, right? So we have this really big thing. God is said to exist up here in the third heaven, right? The third, second, first, earth, paradise, hell. So we know kind of where God is, right? And we get a little bit of a description of God, because who knows that God is timeless, right? That God doesn't really have a time, right? We get a lot of titles, and look at verse 14 here in Exodus, right? We get the first real description of God. It says, "And God said unto Moses, I am that I am." Right? And so God describes himself in this really interesting way, right? It's not, like I'm taller. It's not like I am your God. This description is I am. I exist, right? If you turn to Revelation chapter 1, we did quite a long study in that book. What was it, last year? But we had quite a long study there, and we can see that God describes himself as essentially timeless here as well. In verse 8, he says, I am the Alpha and Omega, right? And in the Greek alphabet, you have Alpha and Omega, and this was like the first and the last letter. And so what he's saying is, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, I'm the beginning and the end. And he goes on to say, I'm the beginning and the end, right? In that verse 8, he says, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come. And he covers those three points of time, right? He says, which is, right? In that verse 8, which is, which means the present. And then he says, and which was, in the past, right? And which is to come, the Almighty. So we have this description of who God is, and he exists outside of time. And if he exists outside of time, we can kind of infer some more things about that. But I feel like I've beaten that horse to death whenever I talk to you guys, so we're not going to. Instead, I want to talk about one of the more interesting things in the Bible, which is the portions of the Bible where it actually talks about God moving time, right? So I mean, in general, time is pretty standard. It moves on at a regular rate. But there's 2 points in the Bible where time is stopped or moved forward or backward. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. If you go to 2 Kings chapter 20, this is kind of where we'll be at tonight for most of it. And in 2 Kings chapter 20, we have a king. He's actually one of the few good kings of Judah, right? And it's King Hezekiah, right? It's the name you always make fun of, and it's like, yeah, it's in 2nd Hezekiah, right? It's like that book, the book of the Bible, where you're trying to confuse your friends. And it's King Hezekiah. And Hezekiah's really sick, right? Hezekiah's really, really sick, and Isaiah, the prophet, this big prophet guy, right? Imagine somebody who can like predict the future and is constantly right about it. And they come up to you and say, get your house in order, you're going to die. Isaiah did that to Hezekiah. He walks up to the king, he's like, hey, you need to have your will in order because you're out of here, man. You're done. And so Hezekiah, he gets real depressed, and the Bible says something quite interesting. If you look in verse 2 of chapter 20, it says, then he turned his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord. So he shuts everything out, and he prays unto the Lord, right? And you can see what his prayer was in verse 3. I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. So he's asking God, remember the things I've done. Remember the things I've done. And that works today, right? No, I'm just kidding. No. Pastor Mark's yelling at me. I can hear him. No, it doesn't work today, right? You don't live longer through good works, right? You just kind of live and die. You live and die according to God's timeline. If we walk down to verse 8 here, this is after Isaiah says, the Lord has heard you, and I'm going to grant you this thing. Like I'm going to let you live longer. So if we come on down to verse 8, we can see something really interesting. And Hezekiah said unto Isaiah, what shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, right? As a nation today, I mean, we're Gentiles today. Do we require signs? Do we require signs? I mean, do we? Yes? No? Come on. No. Yeah, so we don't require signs today. It's something very specific to the nation of Israel. And we kind of have a little bit of a picture of Jesus Christ here, because you'll see, if you look up, that after 3 days, he gets healed, is essentially what happens. And it's kind of showing that after 3 days, who was going to die is no longer dead. It becomes a type of Christ, but it's a different lesson. But if we look at verse 9 here, he's asking for a sign, and that's not uncommon with, the Israelites. You have Gideon. I'm sad Gideon's not here. That's a shame. Gideon. But Gideon, right, he lays out the fleece. And he's like, hey, Lord, if I'm going to do this, make the land outside of this dry and make the fleece wet. And then he asks him to do the inverse. And, it's a normal thing. And you think of Jesus Christ coming, the wise men, they look out and they see, they're like, all of the signs point to this. There's literally a giant star that we're following, and they're following the star to find Jesus Christ. And so the nation of Israel is looking for signs. And Hezekiah wants one too. And let's see what Hezekiah's sign is. And Isaiah said, this sign shalt thou have of the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he hath spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees or go back 10 degrees? So Isaiah gives him a choice. He says, hey, is the shadow going to go forward 10 degrees or back 10 degrees? Now, what's that talking about? Well, what is the shadow? And what does it mean to go forward 10 degrees, back 10 degrees? Anyone know? Yeah, essentially, right? So in those days, we had in order to tell time, they didn't have iPhones or anything like that nonsense, right? They had what was called a sundial. And what a sundial was essentially, if I were to turn that for you, that would actually be a point. It'd be raised, right? And what would happen is, oh, I actually drew this wrong. This is a modern sundial. I'm sorry. The sundials of those days were a half circle, and they had a point that kind of came out like that. And what would happen is, as the sun would travel around the sundial, the shadow would move. And that's how they would tell time, is they would look at where the shadow was. And so what he means is for those of you who have taken geometry or are taking geometry, right, you can designate that a circle is 360 degrees around, right? So a half circle then would be how many degrees? Math lesson? 180, there you go. He's going to ask me if I did something with math, so I have to do a little bit. And so, it's 180 degrees here. And so Isaiah's giving him a choice. He's saying, hey, what do you want God to do? Would you rather have God move the shadow forward 10 degrees or backward 10 degrees, right? Backward meaning, going back in time, right? And Hezekiah gives his answer. If you look in verse 10 here. And Hezekiah answered, it is a light thing. He puts a little pun in there, by the way. It's a light thing. It's different language, it's fine. It is a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees. Nay, but let the shadow return backward 10 degrees. And so we can see the response here in verse 11. And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down the dial of Ahaz. So if the shadow went back 10 degrees, how long was that? This is like a weird story problem, right? If you have 180 degrees and this many minutes. Well, the first thing you need to know here is that the Israelites, their day consisted of 12 hours. It started at 6 o'clock in the morning and ended at 6 o'clock at night. And so we can divide this into 12 hours. So in order to see how long an hour was, because there wasn't a minute hand. You can't have a minute hand in this situation, right? It's only the hour hand. So in order to figure that out, we divide the 180 by 12 here. And so if we do 180 divided by 12, right, it goes in here once, and then that's 6, and then 5. So it's 15 degrees. Did I do that right? I think so. Or 15, what is that word? Degradations? No. 15 lines, 15 equally spaced lines, right? Sections, thank you. Good night. And so you have, I'm not going to get 15 in here, but imagine that there's 15 of these, right? And the shadow, where that is, that would be 15. And so you have 15 different lines for each of the hours, right? But those 15 different placements, right, they represent a full 60 minutes, right? And they represent a full 60 minutes of those hours. And so if we really look at it, and I'll get into why this is interesting in just a second here, if you just follow the math, you'll find that 10 degrees, 15 degrees being a full hour, 10 degrees would be how much of an hour then? Quick math, right? What'd you say? That's exactly right. It's 2/3, right? So if we have 15 degrees equals 1 hour, 10 degrees then is going to equal, 2/3 of an hour, which would be 40 minutes. So you have 40 minutes. And Lydia, let's see if you remember this. What was the number 40 when we were doing the numbers? What was number 40? Not quite. That was the one after. That's 42. Exactly right. 40 is a time of testing in the Bible. And you can see that all throughout the Bible, right? We have Jesus Christ. How long was Jesus Christ in the wilderness for? 40 days, right? And how long were the Israelites in the wilderness for? 40 years, right? And so you see this number 40 go all throughout the Bible. And we see it here again when we do a little bit of, quick maths, right? We do a little bit of quick maths. We're at 40 minutes. Now we just need 40 hours. I got to find 40 hours in the Bible somewhere. I'll get there because I've got 40 days. I've got 40 years. I need 40 months. I need 40 hours. Beside the point. So the clock moves backwards by 40 minutes. And so we can see here that Isaiah the prophet, by beseeching God, has said, hey, let's move it backwards by 40 minutes. Let's move it backwards by 40 minutes. And he does that. And so in that moment, time had moved backwards. It wasn't like some ellipse or like eclipse that came through and did it. I mean, he actually moved time backwards by 40 minutes. And if that doesn't kind of blow your mind, I mean, that was a real thing that happened. I mean, if that doesn't kind of blow your mind, you're crazy, man. Like really, let that be real to you, just for a second. Like time literally went backwards for 40 minutes. I mean, I guess, we fall back in time and we spring forward in time, right? But this was a literal, the sun moved backwards in the sky. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it wasn't like time travel how you think of it, right? Like the sun in the sky literally moved backward. I mean, if we go back to the creation account, let's go back to Genesis here. If we go back to the creation account, when he makes the sun and the moon, he makes it for a specific reason. Right? In verse 17, and God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. Or in verse 16, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. In 17, and God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So God makes these two lights to give an account of time, right? And he literally moves the sun back, which is kind of mind-blowing. And so we can see that God can kind of affect time. And he can do a lot more than that. Let's go to Isaiah 34:4. We're talking about the prophet of Isaiah. We want to see a little bit of what else God can do here to give us a better perception of who our God is. I mean, we live in the age of grace. It's so easy today to just say, hey, like our God's a God of grace, right? We don't really realize some of the things that God actually does and can do. I mean, I think back to when they were transporting the Ark of the Covenant, and somebody went out and tried to reach and stop the Ark from falling, and the guy was struck dead immediately, right? And all of these different things. I mean, God has these Israelites go through and kill just nations, like men, women, children. I mean, because of the corrupted seed line, we know, but and we'll see more of what he does later. But this is something that's quite interesting as well. Isaiah 34, verse 4 here. And Isaiah is a prophetical book, right? And Isaiah here is prophesying, I'm pretty sure, about the tribulation. And so we'll kind of look at this in just a second. And all the hosts of heaven, in verse 4, shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. Right? There's an interesting connection here between the figs, and that was how Hezekiah was healed. He was supposed to burn some figs. But what's really interesting is that the Bible is literally talking about how the sky gets rolled up like a scroll. Right? I mean, you can roll up like a blanket, but imagine looking up and seeing our atmosphere roll in on itself. And then out of that opening, you see the stars of heaven, or in this case, this is the angels, right? You see the angels falling down. I mean, this is the casting out of the angels from heaven, is what this is describing. And we can see its prophetical, its prophecy coming true, if you will. We're not there yet because it's in a prophecy coming true in Revelation 6:14. So if we go over to Revelation 6:14, we get the prophecy coming true once it happens here. And it says, and the heaven departed as a scroll when it was rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their place. So when he rolls these heavens, right, the mountains and the islands, they move. I mean, can you imagine? Just like Mount Everest. I know we live in Michigan. It's flat, right? I get it. Whatever. We don't have islands. But there's mountains out there, I promise. And these mountains, massive mountains, are moved out of their place because God, I imagine God, he's bigger than all of this. And he reaches his hands in, and he opens this up. And then he forces the angels down and out and down onto the earth. And it's if you keep that in your mind, that's not like some poetry or some story that's made up. That's a legitimate thing that is going to happen. And it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around. So we established that this is 40 minutes. God moved time 40 minutes. Whoop-de-doo. Whatever. Just moving time. It's fine. Go to Joshua 10 for me, if you're following along. And this is where I find things very interesting, because we know that God is a wise master builder, right? He follows a process. He follows a design. and it wouldn't really make sense to just move time for like a little bit. It just feels off. It'd feel like, oh, we've been behind for 40 minutes ever since, right? Like, we've had an extra 40 minutes this whole time. It would feel off. So if you go to Joshua chapter 10 here, we get an account of Joshua being the bad man that he is. Right? Joshua's the guy who went through, he killed just all the people, right? He went through and they killed all of this corrupted seed line and got them all out of the promised land. He rounded them up. And we see this happen here. And this account is what really gives a lot of power to God here, because this is I'll say the largest showcasing of his power that ever was, and probably ever will be up until the tribulation. So, chapter 10, verse 7. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. Verse 8, and the Lord said unto Joshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly, and went up from Gilgal all night. So he travels all night to go and fight these guys. And the Lord discomfited them, right, before Israel. So they're very uncomfortable, right? They're very out of sorts, they're out of rank. Like this whole army's just not ready for them. It's like if you tried to screw in a screw, right, and you strip it, right? It's not ready and it's discomfited and you can't get it out. And they're in a really bad spot. And the Lord sent where was I? 10. The Lord discomfited them before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon. So there's this massive slaughter that happens, right? And chased them along the way that goeth up to Bethoron. Who's good at reading? I don't know. Bethoron. That Beth place. And smote them to Azekah and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel and were going down to Beth-horon, and that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven, right? So we see, well, let's finish the verse here. It's great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. There were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword, right? So the Bible's literally saying, hey, God has cast down meteors on these people. I mean, maybe it could be like hail, like ice hail, but can you imagine like in the dry land of like Israel, like ice, like falling down? I firmly believe he's calling down meteors on these guys. And it says that these meteors killed more people than all the Israelites did. And I mean, he's just like throwing stones. Like imagine him out here and he's like, just like throwing stones out of these people. It's an amazing thing to think about. Verse 12, then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said, in the sight of Israel, sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon, right? So this is the only real other place in the Bible where we see this kind of sun and moon being told to stand still or to move. Joshua says, hey, I want you to stand still. He's asking God, using the power that God has given him, saying, hey, sun and moon, you're going to stand still. And we can see the results of that here. The main reason is because, they were literally killing them as fast as they could. They couldn't kill them any faster. They needed the sun to stay out so that the Israelites don't kill the Israelites. Because when it's dark, right, there's like LEDs or night. The Israelites aren't walking around with swords and like these brand new night vision goggles, right? It's like we're going dark. No, because they need the sun. So they need the sun to see who they're killing. And so the sun stays up, right? And the sun stays there so they can finish the killing. And we'll see how long it happens in the valley of Ajalon. In verse 13 here, and the sun stood still and the moon stayed. So the moon, on the opposite side, wherever that is, right, and the sun, it stayed still until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day. So that sun stood there for about a whole day, right? Now, how long do you think about a whole day? If someone's like, I was there for, about a day, or it's about a day away, right? It's slightly less than 24 hours, right? It's about a day, right? I mean, maybe, and this is just kind of my own thought process thinking about it, is maybe, it's 23 hours and 20 minutes, right? It stayed there. Because then, if we add the 23 hours and 20 minutes to the 40 minutes, that the Son moved back in time, we get a whole day that God kind of just inserts into his timeline, right? An entire day, because, because we have 23 hours, 20 minutes. You add those, that's 60 minutes, and 60 minutes equals an hour. So now we're up to 24 hours. That's a day, right? And so it's really interesting to see that, God kind of halts time for a day with Joshua, and then he gives Hezekiah over there an extra 40 minutes. And if you think about it, that makes up a whole day. So God has this plan way out there. He's like, all right, I'm setting a day aside. I'm just going to insert it right here. I'm going to take a little bit, put it over here, and that way I can do what I want and show the people who I am and my power. Right? Verse 14. And there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Right? So there's no other day. There's no other day before that or after that where God was like, hey, time, stand still. Stand still. And if we continue reading on, we get another interesting kind of side study that you can do. It says, and Joshua returned and all Israel with him unto the camp up to Gilgal. But these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave of Makkedah. And if you keep reading the story, you find that they find out where they are, and they roll a stone in front of these kings that are in the cave and just trap them in the cave and let them die, right? Number 5 in the Bible. Who knows what that's for? Number 5. Yeah? Death. That's right. There's 5 kings. Isn't that interesting? Numbers are cool. Numbers are cool. So that's kind of how, I like, that's one of the really more interesting things in the Bible is the day that, God stops time, right? He stops it for an entire day, saves himself a little extra, gives it to Hezekiah, and it counts for an entire day. It doesn't really affect us really that much, right? I mean, Israel was a very, very time-centric people, right? Israel is all about the earth, and because they're about the earth, they need time, right? Because the earth has time, always will have time, right? And eventually, they need time. But because we're a heavenly-based people, we don't really care much about time, right? We don't have a set day for when the rapture happens, right? We have no idea when it's going to happen. But in any kind of prophecy, they can point to it and say, all right, it's going to be on this day, once the rapture happens, they're like, all right, 3.5 years, this happens, right? And 3.25 years, this happens. And then on this day, wormwood gets cast down into the river and all these things. But we don't have any of those prophecies because we're not a time-based people. We get to go up here into the second and third heaven and rule and reign with Jesus Christ because we're the Gentiles. So, yeah. Thank you for listening to the ramblings of a madman, clearly. So we'll pray, we'll be done. That's all I really wanted to talk about today. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, Lord. Thank you for all you've given to us. Please help my words to have been effective, Lord, and please help the kids here to meditate on the words and on the Bible and to grow closer to you in their relationship, Lord. Please help them to have a good rest of the week and to be a light for you